Constraint errors typically appear as you build an assembly. This makes it easy to avoid getting into too much trouble. You simply click Undo when an error appears and find a different way to proceed. This works when you're the only person working on an assembly, but if others are involved, it's possible that you may inherit an assembly where every single constraint has something wrong with it. Another challenging situation may involve replacing components in an assembly. Often swapping one component for another can lead to multiple constraint errors. Inventor provides several tools for identifying and repairing constraint errors. In these next lessons, we'll take a look at how these tools are best applied in certain situations. We'll begin with the most common situation, where you are the only person working on an assembly, and you're faced with errors along the way. As you work on an assembly, the most important guideline to follow in order to avoid being overwhelmed by constraint errors is to fix errors as they occur. Sometimes users will ignore errors to avoid being sidetracked from the actual building of the assembly. The problem with this is that constraint errors have a tendency to snowball as you add more and more components and constraints to an assembly. Typically, when an error is ignored, it's because the user does not understand why the error occurred in the first place. Let's take a look at some common trouble areas you should have in mind when working with assemblies. First, it's a good idea to avoid creating redundant constraints. In Inventor, redundant constraints are not reported as errors. This can lead to a bad habit of creating too many constraints that do nothing for you at all. Aside from wasting your time and creating a cluttered browser, redundant constraints can lead to real errors when you make changes to your assemblies. Let's use this assembly as an example. Notice at this moment there are no errors in this assembly at all. At some point, it becomes necessary to make the plate 1 inch longer. To make this change quickly, I'll edit the part and use Move Face to add an inch. When I return to the assembly, the warning dialog displays because moving the face caused a constraint error. I'll click Accept so we can look into the cause. First, I'll expand the bracket so we don't have to look at other constraints. When I move the cursor over the constraints, I can see the faces of the bracket are constrained to the faces of the plate, and the bracket holes are aligned with the holes in the plate. The problem is that the flush constraints and the axial mate constraints are redundant because they both position the bracket on top of the plate. What is significant about this is that before I made the change to the position of the hole, the flush and axial mate constraints were simply redundant. Inventor didn't care that they were each controlling the position of this bracket component as long as they were not in conflict. By avoiding the use of redundant constraints like these, you can easily avoid having to deal with constraint errors that will sneak up on you in the future. Resolving this error is now simply a matter of deciding how this component position should be defined. Since I want the holes on these components to be aligned, I'll simply delete the flush constraint and the problem will disappear. Note that I am deleting both flush constraints. Even though there wasn't a problem with the first flush constraint, it is still redundant and could fail in the future.